Nemesis is an Agatha Christie mystery written in 1971, in which Miss Marple is given a task by an attorney with no information about what the task actually is. We as Christie's readers are in a similar situation with respect to the law. Certain things are expected of us as we attempt to navigate the hidden legal realm of jurisdiction, but we're given no clear information about what those things are. This line from the novel sums up the task of Miss Marple. She had been directed first to the lawyer's office, then to read a letter, 2 letters, in her home, then to be sent on a pleasant and well-run tour round some of the famous houses and gardens of Great Britain. There's no mention of a crime or even the concept of justice, but it does speak to homes and gardens, with an emphasis on place. The plot slowly unfolds, showing that Miss Marple will be attempting to solve the murder of a girl named Verity Hunt, making Miss Marple's task a truth hunt. In the story, it's been arranged for Miss Marple to take a tour of famous houses and gardens of Great Britain, known as Tour 37. Other women also on this tour are named Miss Lumley, Mrs. Risley Porter, Miss Barrow, and Elizabeth Temple. All names that relate to sacred points in the land, 2 ending in LEY, suggesting the ley lines that lead to barrows and temples throughout the English countryside. In Chapter 5, we're told that Mrs. Risley Porter might have information of some kind which Miss Marple might find had a bearing on matters. Mrs. Risley Porter turns out to have no impact on the story at all, but the mention of her name with regard to the concept of bearing is giving us a hint about place, the power or spirit of place known as the Genius Loci. The more ancient meaning of ley or lea is a meadow or field, though Stapledon and Davies clarify that definition in their book Ley Farming. Ley, lea, or ley, the Oxford Dictionary tells us inter alia, implies arable land under grass. Land laid down for pasture, grassland. So a ley line would seem to mean lines running through the meadows and fields. Because ancient ley lines were also paths from one site to another, it's easy to presume that the word lane may have evolved from the 2 words ley line. And it's on a lane that the girl named Verity, or Truth, was found dead, as it was explained to Miss Marple by a character named Clotilde. Then they found her, in a kind of ditch hedgy spot, down an unfrequented lane, where anyone hardly ever went. Yes, I had to go and view the body in the mortuary. A terrible sight. I can't bear it. I can't bear it. The repetition of bear it points back to the word bearing, calling to mind the importance of place. There was something here that she ought to notice, something she ought to take note of, something that had a bearing. We use bearings to navigate the Earth's grid, to find the direction or heading we need to reach a specific location. A specific location is a specific point on the Earth's grid, measured using latitude and longitude in the macro or metes and bounds in the micro. Wikipedia tells us that a bearing is an azimuth, the clockwise angle between a precise location on the Earth's grid and true north. On his website, Ley Lines Decoded, Mike Peer tells of something he found on the Earth grid. Some 40 years ago, I made an extraordinary discovery. Certain ancient sites in the area around my hometown of Guildford were arranged within the landscape in a seemingly intentional pattern. Some sites fall upon bearings of 10 degrees from a common point and are aligned at regular distances from that point. On one alignment, I calculated a high point where I suspected a site may have existed, and consequently discovered an unrecorded barrow at precisely that point, later confirmed by the county archaeologist. A barrow is an ancient burial mound, a specific location on the Earth's grid where the dead have been consecrated, and it was the failure to find Verity's body to successfully navigate to the unfrequented lane that allowed her killer to hide the murder for so long. But, spoiler alert, if you plan to read or watch Nemesis, the character of Miss Barrow is pointing us to the fact that the body of Verity was not the body found on the lane. Verity's body would be found later, consecrated in a barrow mound in the Bradbury Scots garden. Agatha Christie has Miss Marple navigating a series of bearings and ley lines to sort out the death of Verity Hunt. However, a subplot then emerges in Nemesis. A new murder takes place, the murder of Elizabeth Temple, as she ascends a hill or high place housing a memorial tower. Here, the metaphor links death with a temple. And unlike the first body, found dead in a low ditch, Miss Temple is killed on a high point of land. Miss Marple isn't present when this crime occurs because her benefactor, Jason Raphael, has set her up for a few days in the old manor house. He's done this because he thought Miss Marple was not fit to attempt the particular ascent of this rather difficult climb up the headland to where there was a memorial tower. This hinting at the difficulty and danger of elevated land rings back to the name of Mrs. Risley Porter, whose name suggests a ley line that's rising. We've come to describe the rising and falling of land as the lay of the land, but perhaps it's more accurately termed the lay of the land. In this case, the members of Tour 37 are following a ley line or path that's rising to the location of a memorial tower, a place for remembering the dead. For remembering the dead. Of course, a memorial tower is really more about honoring the dead, whereas the verb remember can be literally defined as what Isis did when Osiris was dismembered by Seth. It was more than simply honoring him, she remembered him. Another way of saying this is that she reincorporated him into a corpus, a single body, rather than one partitioned out into its various members. There's a televised scene from Nemesis on the BBC that wasn't in Agatha Christie's novel, where Elizabeth Temple asks Miss Marple's nephew if he believes in the spirit of place. He responds by saying, "The jolly old Genius Loci, eh?" This is an interesting addition to the story. It connects Christie's Nemesis to Alexander Pope's moral essays, as Miss Marple's Tour 37 of Houses and Gardens is essentially the same framework used by Alexander Pope to discuss the Genius Loci. Genius Loci was first expressed in the pre-Christian Roman classical religion. We're told it embodied a protective spirit of place. This understanding may have evolved from the description in Plato's Republic of the role of a genius. In Book 10's myth of Plato wrote of a spirit that directs our lives, and Lachesis sent with each, as the guardian of his life and the fulfiller of his choice, the genius that he had chosen, and this divinity led the soul first to Clotho, under her hand and her turning of the spindle to ratify the destiny of his lot and choice. And after contact with her, the genius again led the soul to the spinning of Atropos to make the web of its destiny irreversible. This genius later came to be understood as a person's innate abilities, but was also associated with the innate abilities of a place. Thousands of years later, in 1751, Alexander Pope would refer to this importance of architecture and gardening, homes and gardens, where all must be adapted to the genius and use of the place. In Epistle 4, Pope writes that we should consult the genius of the place in all, that tells the waters or to rise or fall, or helps the ambitious hill the heavens to scale, or scoops in circling theatres the veil. Eventually, Pope acknowledges that the Genius Loci directs the intending lines. Was he referring to the lines of lay that rise and fall with each hill and valley? Another character on Tour 37 is Emlyn Price, a young man distracting the attention of Mrs. Risley Porter's niece, attention that Mrs. Risley Porter wished to remain on her. As such, Emlyn and Mrs. Risley Porter are at odds. The name Emlyn means around the valley, and Christie is actually naming characters with terms that describe land to pit those characters against one another. But noticing the differences and purposes between lowlands and highlands is part of acknowledging Pope's concept of the Genius Loci. In A Pattern Language, a 20th century book on city planning that Dane shared with me, Christopher Alexander points out that lowlands, where water pools, are generally most useful for growing water-hungry crops, while higher land is better suited for erecting flood-averse structures like homes and churches. As Pope suggests, this is a recognition of which places are best suited for which activities, or of consulting the genius of place in all. Another purpose of elevated land is to locate line-of-sight towers and monuments. Court Lindahl makes a connection between the temple, the monument, and the ley line in his book The Sacred Towers of the Axis Mundi, writing that a wide variety of temples or monuments may have been left that included geometrical and philosophical data for later generations to ponder. In this way, they may have been assuring that this information would not be lost in a natural cataclysm or destructive conflict. There is unmistakable evidence that some of these axes mundi were built to point to other monuments that were built by the same people or those who identified with them, and occasionally by opposing groups. Later adherents or members of the same order also valued these ley lines and also placed buildings, events, and even entire cities in this context. Many structures may have been built to both warn us while also recording valuable information for any catastrophe survivors. These monuments were meant to stand the test of time and the elements. According to Mark Allen Wright, an axis mundi is a sacred place that connects heaven and earth. One example is Jacob's Ladder, an axis that provides access to a different place, a portal. When Elizabeth Temple is killed ascending to the memorial tower, she represents the metaphorical body, as the body is considered a temple. The death of the body, Temple, suggests she successfully passed through the portal into either heaven or the underworld. Elizabeth Temple, the body as temple, comprises one individual. But a body is then composed of parts, like muscles, organs, and bones, that are held together by fascia, bands of membranous connective tissue. The word fascia has evolved from the fasces of ancient Greece, referring to the bands that bind this bundle of sticks together. The fasces represents fascism, and it symbolized the group bound together as one. Incorporation. But when an axe head was present, it also symbolized the group as responsible for the violence of that axe. The entire city-state bound together and wielding the weapon not just the magistrate or warrior who swung it. This is why fascism is also described today as corporatism. The bound bundle reflects the corporate form and structure. From the word fasces, we also get the word fasten, meaning to close or bind up with buttons, snaps, or a clasp, as well as the word fascinate, which means to bewitch or captivate. And captivate alludes back to the idea of capture. A term closely related to fascinate is used by Agatha Christie in Nemesis. She remembered wearing that pink shawl scarf she'd been wearing. What used they to call them when she was young? A fascinator. That nice pink shawl scarf of wool that she had put round her head. He had looked at her and laughed. And later, when she had said, she smiled at the remembrance. One word she had used, and he had laughed. The one word is Nemesis, and she was the goddess of retribution who metes out justice. It presents an ironic image, a little old lady wearing a silly headscarf, posing as the vengeful goddess of justice. But there's another reason that it's ironic. The fascinator is peasant wear, described here as hood-shaped, and this fascinator, fastened or closed headwear, is reminiscent of the peasant's captive position, the serf's bond to the farmland of the manor. It alludes to the manor house, the lands surrounding it, and the history of the people who were bound to it. This idea that the body is a temple and the body is bound to the land is clarified in 1 Corinthians 6:19 of the 1611 King James Bible. This chapter is prefaced with the comment, "Our bodies are the members of Christ." It goes on to explain that our bodies belong to God and have been bought with a price. The individual has no rights. Like a slave or a serf, the individual has been bought and does not own him or herself. We are a place in physical reality, and it's a place we don't legally own. Such places, even today, are often owned by a corporation. There's an unimportant character in Agatha Christie's Nemesis named Edmund Anderson. He never appears in the story. He's only briefly mentioned as the second husband of Jason Raphael's former secretary and a train engineer who runs the time and motion branch. But his first name, Edmund, contains the root of the Latin mundi, meaning world, and we might correlate the railway lines that Edmund Anderson was managing as axes mundi or ley lines running across the English countryside. But the Edmund Anderson rabbit hole goes much, much deeper than that. It turns out there was also a real man named Edmund Anderson. He was a legal colleague of Francis Bacon, praised and well liked by Bacon. In 1581, Edmund Anderson was counsel for plaintiff in a famous land dispute known as Shelley's case. Counsel for the defense was Edward Coke, the legal rival of Francis Bacon, who often comes up in my research. Shelley's case is central not only to our understanding of place as genius loci, but also to our understanding of the inheritance of place, the inheritance of land. This is the text from the May 1540 land grant of Barhamwick in Sussex from King Henry VIII to Anne Cobham and then to Edward Shelley, land that had been owned by the newly dissolved monastery of Sion. The facts of Shelley's case have been documented in modern language by Brian Simpson in his 1995 book, Leading Cases in the Common Law. The farm had been granted by Henry VIII to Anne Cobham for her life, and then, by way of remainder, to Edward Shelley and his wife, and the heirs of their bodies begotten. This entailed the lands. Unless the entail was broken, they would pass after the death of Edward and Joan to the direct descendants of their marriage, to their lineal heirs. The final provision of the letters patent of 1540 was a remainder in fee simple to the right heirs of Edward Shelley. The term fee simple, according to Oxford Languages, means a permanent and absolute tenure in land with freedom to dispose of it at will. Notice that this fee simple remainder was not granted to Edward, but to his heirs. David Smith continues the story in the Journal of Legal History. By 1554, the Shelleys had prospered, and Edward had 2 sons who survived into adulthood. Henry was the elder, and having married, had a daughter named Mary. Richard, the younger son, was still unmarried. That same year, however, the fortunes of the Shelleys changed for the worse, when an unknown sickness first took Joan and then Henry. Edward Shelley himself was soon afflicted, and aware that upon his death the entail would guide the descent of the land to Mary, he sought to retain the land within the male line of the family. Edward chose to resettle his lands by an indenture. The indenture instructed recoverers to break the entail by suffering a common recovery to the use of Edward Shelley for his life, and then to lessees for 24 years. This indenture blocked the inheritance of Mary Shelley, ensuring that only a male heir would inherit the land, as Cook explained in his report of the case. The reason wherefore the said Edward Shelley suffered the said recovery was, as it seemeth, because Mary, daughter of his eldest son, named in the special verdict, had inherited, and if the wife of his eldest son had been delivered of a daughter, then had the land gone out of his name, and therefore, for the continuance of the land in his name and family, he suffered the said recovery. 25 years after Edward Shelley died, a lawsuit was filed by Nicholas Wolfe, who was now renting the land from Edward's second son, Richard Shelley. Wolfe accused one Henry Shelley Jr. of trespassing on the land. Henry Jr. was the younger brother of Mary, whose entail had been broken by their grandfather Edward. So although the caption of the case reads Wolfe versus Shelley, the suit really reflects the land dispute between the uncle, Richard Shelley, whose case was argued by Edmund Anderson et al., and his nephew, Henry Shelley Jr., represented in the case by Edward Cook. If Richard Shelley had won the case, and he didn't, it would have been a win for Edward Shelley's heirs, a designation that included Richard. But if Henry Jr., the son of Edward's eldest child, won the case, it would be a win for one heir, the firstborn, a custom known as primogeniture. And a win for primogeniture was also a win for Parliament, which is why Cook argued so strongly for it. Why would it be a win for Parliament? Because primogeniture has historically been pushed by Parliament. In 1797, Edward Hasted explained this by first discussing the opposite of primogeniture, a common inheritance custom in Kent called gavelkind. He began the discussion by referring to the socage tenures of ancient demesne and gavelkind, meaning the feudal tenure of ancient domains of land and the partitioning of that land among several heirs. Hasted goes on to state that it is laid down as a rule that nothing but an act of Parliament can change the nature of gavelkind lands, and this has occasioned the passing of several for the purpose of disgavelling the possessions of diverse gentlemen in this county. To disgavel meant to force primogeniture, or limiting inheritance to one heir, thereby preventing landowners from bequeathing their lands to more than one heir. According to Courtney Stanhope Kenny, in his essay on the history of English primogeniture, Parliament pushed primogeniture because partitioning land was seen as a threat to military strength. Bracton lays down a further rule, Kenny writes, which vividly illustrates the military advantage of primogeniture. Where a partition takes place, the manor house or castle, which is the chief building of a county or a barony, must not be parted. It must be given into the sole charge of the eldest son or daughter, for the right of the sword, which suffers no division. Kenny also states on another page that it was for the sake of the military system alone that primogeniture had been introduced. Primogeniture also ensured that younger-born sons, having no ownership or stake in their family's estate, could be conscripted more easily into the military. But wait, why was primogeniture only pushed by the British Parliament? Surely the monarch would have also recognized that primogeniture was necessary for military strength. Kings even used primogeniture to guide descent to the throne. But kings and queens are also human beings, and easily swayed by the human desire to provide for all of their own children. Many kings were guilty of partitioning up their own empires among squabbling and warring children. Even Henry VIII himself, who treated women rather poorly, was known to have divided his holdings up, giving estates of land to wives he'd divorced, like Anne of Cleves. These decisions weren't made according to policy, they were based on Henry's own feelings of favor or guilt. The point is that kings are human beings with such feelings, and parliaments are not. It's much easier to centralize control at the expense of beloved children when the entity making those decisions is unaccountable, unblameable. And that was the strength of a corporate parliament. It was faceless. Just as the members of a firing squad don't know which one fired the lethal shot, members of groups like Parliament aren't accountable as individuals, and difficult decisions are made more easily. This is the point, the very definition of a corporation. It removes liability from its human members. Shelley's case had a real bearing on how Parliament could use the law to further push primogeniture and further diminish gavelkind, and ultimately the decentralization of family landholdings over time. One of its effects was Coke's use, his actual invention, of two confusing legal terms, words of purchase and words of limitation. They refer to two aspects of a land transfer. Words of limitation describe the land being conveyed, and words of purchase describe the people taking possession of the land. Our modern definition of purchase is not what's meant here by Coke. Wikipedia explains that the word purchase in the expression means that real property is being transferred by deed or will, not inherited through the laws of descent and distribution. If there was no will, the rules of primogeniture kicked in, but wills, grants, and indentures were often constructed when someone wished to circumvent primogeniture. This is exactly what Edward Shelley was doing with his indenture, circumventing the primogeniture descent of his estate to Mary. But according to Smith, Coke argued in Shelley's case that the failure of the will's indenture to name Richard directly suggested that Edward's intended settlement favored Henry. In other words, Coke presumed that Edward Shelley's will was now reverting back to primogeniture, even though the plural word heirs meant just the opposite. In making this argument, Coke was blatantly thwarting Edward Shelley's own intent. Smith tells us this in a footnote. As Anderson himself stated the argument, by these words the intent of Edward appears that he did not wish to have these words, heirs male of the body of Edward, to be words of inheritance, but words of purchase, and that the reason is because he limited which manner of estate they would have, so that by this manner of exposition all the words are able to stand and none of them are void. This may seem like tiresome semantics, but the verdict's result, known as the Shelley's case rule became law, stipulating that if a single grant gives a freehold estate to a person and a remainder to the person's heirs, the remainder belongs to the named person and not the heirs. This was a sweeping power grab by the court and by Parliament to undermine the intent of either a grant or a will. One defense of the rule, published here in Fordham Law Review, addresses this very problem, that it can undermine intent. The chief ground of adverse criticism has been the assumption that the rule is an inflexible doctrine which flies in the face of the settler's intention. This quote then admits what was just pejoratively labeled an assumption is absolutely true. As long as the rule of primogeniture and the preservation of great landed estates remained the keystones of the English law of inheritance, the rule in Shelley's case effected a just result, for while it conceitedly thwarted the particular intent, it did so only that the paramount intent might be effectuated. In Cook's report of the case, he writes, "And Anderson Sargent said it was impossible that Richard Shelley should be in by descent, because no right, title, action, use, etc., limited by the said indentures, did descend to Richard, but only a thing intended to him, which intent in his life received no perfection." In law, the word perfection means completion. So again, this case was about Edward's intent that not only received no legal perfection, but was later actually thwarted by the law. Francis Bacon also criticized the rule's ability to reverse a grantor's intent. In his reading on the Statute of Uses, Bacon refers to the rule here. The conceit, or legal presumption, of Shelley in 24H8 seemeth to me to be without ground, which was that the use succeeded the tenure. A use was like a trust, created in medieval times as a legal workaround for the strict feudal laws of the conveyance of land, known as tenure. When Bacon says that the use succeeded the tenure, he's saying that the use had become as strict and feudal as the land tenure rules it was supposed to replace. And the use was presumed, regardless of intent, just as Cook was literally presuming that King Henry VIII had granted Barham-wick as fee simple to Edward only, rather than in fee tail to Edward and then his heirs. Again flying in the face of the king's intent. The king very clearly granted the land to Anne Cobham, then Edward Shelley, with a remainder for his heirs. Cook's assumption that heirs was a word of limitation rather than a word of purchase is an example of feudal logic, reverting back to the rules of tenure rather than the intent of the king's grant of land. And Cook reverted to feudal logic for one reason, to prevent multiple heirs fragmenting the estate, just as feudal laws did in their time. This was a way to ramrod primogeniture, even when the will didn't choose primogeniture. ChatGPT comes to a similar conclusion, showing that the goal of Parliament was the same goal of feudalism, to prevent the fragmentation of land to accommodate multiple heirs. History has judged Cook's legal construction or presumption harshly, and the rule it established has been abolished in nearly every jurisdiction of common law. But it did adversely affect the heirs of Edward Shelley, and 200 years later, another woman named Mary Shelley, Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley, would write Frankenstein, an allegory about the legal monster and its inability to inherit land. This Mary Shelley happened to be the wife of Percy Bysshe Shelley, Edward's 8th great-grandson. When I deep-dived the story of Frankenstein, I found that the concept of remembering separated body parts into a living monster was equated with the legal act of declaring the dead to be alive, or sestakavi, literally, he who lives. As mentioned earlier, Edmund Anderson ended up losing Shelley's case. But why would Agatha Christie place into Nemesis the name of a 16th century barrister who lost a land inheritance case to Edward Coke? Most will likely think it a coincidence, but in the novel, Christie does make several subtle points on the topic of inheritance. The woman who would later marry Edmund Anderson in the story had received an inheritance from Mr. Raphael. In fact, the only people in Nemesis who inherit anything are females. The three Bradbury Scott sisters have inherited the old manor house from their uncle, a detail that points back to the Shelley case, with the nephew and his uncle fighting over the inheritance of Barhamwick Manor. This detail was changed in the BBC version to a different backstory in which the Bradbury Scott girls had grown up there. But in the novel, Miss Marple remarks that the girls didn't belong to this house. It had belonged to an uncle of theirs, and they'd come here to live some years ago. Agatha Christie also seems to be saying something about Edmund Anderson himself. The narration describing Esther Walters, the woman who would later marry Edmund Anderson, paints the relationship with suspicion. Miss Marple hoped that Esther Walters had married again, some nice, kindly, reliable man. It seemed faintly unlikely. Esther Walters, she thought, had had rather a genius for liking the wrong kind of men to marry. Was Edmund Anderson the wrong kind of man? Maybe so. In contrast to Anderson, the character in Nemesis with Cook's name is eventually revealed as a protector. Edmund Anderson is mentioned in the novel only once and quickly forgotten. It should not be lost on Christie's mystery readers that the murderer here is Clotilde, the woman who inherited the old manor house. If we dig a bit deeper, we uncover the reason why Clotilde inherited the old manor house from her uncle. Her uncle only had one son, you see, explained Miss Bradbury Scott, and he was killed in the war. It's restated for emphasis in Chapter 10. Belonged to old Colonel Bradbury Scott, the old manor house did. Did he have any children? A son what was killed in the war. That's why he left the place to his nieces, nobody else to leave it to. Young men killed in war becomes a bit of a theme in Nemesis, and we see it again in Chapter 8 when Anthea is talking of the manor's garden. During the war, one could not get any gardeners. We had a very young gardener, and then he was called up. One does not, of course, grudge that. Anthea is articulating here the disposable nature of the young with respect to war. And it's really war that killed truth, by allowing inheritances that never should have happened, giving access to the manor demesne that, through murder, turned home and garden into a grave barrow and memorial. But an even easier takeaway from Nemesis is the fact that truth is to be found in barrows, that the genius loci of the barrow, mound, or hill should be noticed for its bearing on matters, and I think Christie does a decent job of highlighting the importance of place, the genius loci, through fiction. In 1588, Edward Coke shows up on our radar again, this time arguing for plaintiff in the case of Marriott versus Pascal. This case, though, isn't about land inheritance. It's about the importance of place, the genius loci, in a legal corporation. Cook's plaintiff was attempting to evict Pascal from the Hospital of the Savoy because Pascal's lease used a name for the hospital that failed to designate, in certainty, the corporation's physical location. To prove my minor, Cook stated, I do say that this word, de, as here, de Savoy, designs a place. So as by this word, de, the place has become parcel of the name, but only the very name. For here, by pretense of the name in this lease, there is not any place of the corporation in the name. But the corporation is transitory, which cannot be. For a corporation especial, consisting of many persons, as corpus aggregatum, ought to have a certain place of their abiding, or otherwise it cannot be discerned by the law, and it is but a mathematical thing, and nothing else but a fiction, and they cannot be otherwise considered in law, but as they are circumscripti within the bounds of their house. And this admission by Coke that a corporation is nothing else but a fiction is the result of the fact that the corporation has a name only and no place. Its location is what makes it real and is what pulls it into the legal realm of a real entity. A similar legal case relating to place came up 24 years later, called the case of Sutton's Hospital, still cited today as a landmark legal precedent that shaped all of corporate law. In 1612, Coke was now Chief Justice of the Common Pleas, and Bacon had risen to Solicitor General. More importantly, the rivalry between them was now quite heated. Like Coke had done 24 years earlier in Marriott versus Pascal, Bacon now argued for the necessity of corporate place, something the Sutton Hospital Corporation lacked. And his argument was this: the place of every corporation ought to be certain, for without a certain place there cannot be any incorporation. A place by a known name is not sufficient to support the name of an incorporation, but the same ought to be described by metes and bounds. In these arguments of both Coke in 1588 and Bacon in 1612, a real physical place was seen as a legally necessary feature of a corporation, as the name alone was insufficient. In fact, as Coke pointed out in Marriott versus Pascal, the name of the Hospital of the Savoy was a pretense, and without a corresponding place referred to in the name of the corporation, it was nothing but a fiction. Back then, the genius loci, or the spirit of place, is what separated a real corporation from a legal fiction. Remember that Coke and Bacon were rivals who usually sat on the opposite sides of an issue. Now, in 1612, Coke sat as judge in the case of Sutton's Hospital, and here he ruled against Bacon's real entity argument. Coke wrote, "As to the fourth exception, that the place of every corporation ought to be certain, to that the charter itself expressly answers. All the house itself, gardens and orchards, etc., are named by the name of the hospital." Now, suddenly, a name was enough. But the problem was that the hospital hadn't been built before Mr. Sutton died, so the house was quite a different physical reality than the intended incorporated hospital. Coke had an answer for that as well. For the said ordinance that the said house should be an hospital is intended only of the mechanical part of an actual hospital, and this hospital in intention only is sufficient to support the name of a corporation, and the words de presente do in law incorporate them presently, and shall not stay till there be an actual hospital, or till the house be fitted or furnished, which is the mechanical part of the hospital. The legal necessity of a real entity, an actual hospital, was now dismissed by Coke as something unnecessary, simply mechanical. Something Coke himself described as both mathematical and fictional 24 years earlier. And yet, even Coke, in his backpedaling on the importance of place, admitted that there had to be something else, in addition to the name, to support the name of the corporation. In the case of Sutton's Hospital, the intention of a potential hospital would be enough if it also included a spot or hole for its foundation, by which it appeareth that a void place or soil in which an house is intended to be built may by the king's charter be named a house, and this nominative house shall be sufficient to support the name of the incorporation. Here, Coke admits that this is a house in name only, but a nominative house, for none was then built. But although a real place was not required, a void place was still necessary. Even Coke couldn't get around the necessity of place, a location identifiable on the Earth's grid. In quadam loco, meaning a certain place that abutteth and boundeth the soil. Since the 1400s, the law viewed corporate names alone as lacking substance, as legal historian David Jan Smith points out in his 2021 article on the Sutton Hospital case. The English yearbooks likewise contained passing evidence for fictional ideas about corporations, such as a statement by Sergeant Richard Pigot in The Abbot of St. Home that a corporation was only a name and could not be seen and did not have substance. A corporation in name only was a fiction, and this phrase, in name only, is a pejorative one. Francis Bacon speaks to this in a letter to King James, in which he complains that hospitals of the time were hiding behind the fictional names of hospitals while simply operating as money-making schemes that did little to help the poor. As it comes to pass in diverse hospitals of this realm, which have but the names of hospitals, and are but wealthy benefices, in respect of the mastership, but the poor, which is the propter quid, little relieved. The poor were the propter quid, or the reason the hospitals existed in the first place, but those poor people were little relieved. But with all this legal precedent, emphasizing the importance of place, why did Coke suddenly reverse his legal position regarding the necessity of a corporation's physical location? In his article on the case of Sutton's Hospital, David Chan Smith writes that all readings of the case have relied upon the single report published by Coke, who was involved in the hospital in ways that would now implicate significant conflicts of interest, including as one of its governors. Coke's partisanship was also evident in other ways. He was advising the governors during the early equity court proceedings and had been a debtor to Sutton. So we can blame the corruption of Edward Coke for the fact that corporate law shifted in 1612 from an emphasis on real corporate entities to the corruptible legal fictions we still know today. He did this by placing greater importance on name than on place. In 1594, just 6 years after Coke's first legal argument in Marriott versus Pascal, pitting name against place, a play was written that cleverly portrayed the tension between name and place. That play was Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, a variation on the chemical romance, or, in this case, the ecclesiastical rather than chemical act of incorporation, as Friar Lawrence states as he prepares to marry the two lovers. Come, come with me, and we will make short work, for by your leaves you shall not stay alone, till Holy Church incorporate two in one. Friar Lawrence turns out to be an alchemist as well, one who disincorporates, as shown in his use of distillation, defined by Wikipedia as the process of separating the component substances of a liquid mixture of two or more chemically discrete substances. When Friar Lawrence gives Juliet the potion he refers to as distilling liquor, it then causes a fictional death, or the appearance of death, representing the dead entity that only the incorporating chemist can reanimate. His ability to reanimate Juliet is very similar to the power of Mary Shelley's Dr. Frankenstein. And it's at this very same time in history, when legal minds are formulating the concept of corporate names, that Juliet famously asked the sky above her back garden, "What's in a name?" Before we can look at the possible answers to that question, we need to notice that the names in the play have very specific meanings themselves. Romeo's last name, Montague, literally Mont and Ague, means mountain rising or pointed hill. The name Capulet can be broken into cap, meaning head or ruler, and Eulet, meaning either a peevish or lonely person. Someone lonely is single, just one, and a single cap could easily refer to the single capstone of a pyramid, also a pointed hill. Curiously, cap can also refer to a headland, the very same word Agatha Christie used to describe the ascending hill of the monument where Miss Temple was killed. And it's in the Capulet monument that Juliet is laid to rest, even before she's dead. In fact, both Nemesis and Romeo and Juliet involve deaths that occur at a monument. Juliet is laid low, but inside her family's vault. And vault means high. A mausoleum or vault is a tomb that is elevated, just as the monument in Nemesis sits on top of a hill or a montague. So to answer Juliet's question, one of the first things we're seeing in a name is a reflection of the land itself. And while Montague and Capulet mean hill, Emlyn and Shelley both mean valley. So all four of these names refer to the lay or lay of the land. Names reflecting places might be a form of shorthand, a combination of corporate name and place that even Cook couldn't completely circumvent. Recall that Cook first said a corporation requires a place, then recanted, and finally qualified his position by requiring a potential place. Of course, Juliet's question, "What's in a name?" is rhetorical, and she goes on to answer it for herself. That which we call a rose by any other word would smell as sweet. So Romeo would, were he not Romeo called, retain that dear perfection which he owes without that title Romeo. And it's here that we see the play isn't really about love at all. It's about, unfortunately, land ownership and inheritance, and how the wrong name, like Montague, can prevent the legal possession of land. Our first clue that the play is about the transfer of land is in this line, "Retain that dear perfection which he owes without that title Romeo." It's usually misinterpreted to mean that even if Romeo had some other name, he'd still be perfect. But the monetary term owes suggests a very different meaning here, referring to the concept of legal perfection, defined by Wikipedia as the additional steps taken in relation to a security interest. As we saw earlier in Shelley's case, the legal term perfection means completion. But Francis Bacon used the term more specifically in his Elements of the Common Laws of England, "As if I covenant with my son to stand sized unto his use of the lands which I shall afterwards purchase, yet the use is void, and the reason is, because there is no new act, nor transmutation of possession following to perfect this inception." Here, Bacon's use of the verb perfect corresponds to Wikipedia's definition of additional actions taken after the first action, the inception. Legal perfection, even today, can be expressed through various additional actions, but the two most common are retaining title or taking possession, and both methods are mentioned right here in Romeo and Juliet, with 4 words correlating to the Wikipedia definition: perfection, retain, title, and later possession in Act 3, Scene 2. Ultimately, Romeo is a debtor who owes this perfection, or interest security, to his creditor, Juliet's father. And we know it's Capulet because Romeo tells us, "Is she a Capulet? O dear account, my life is my foe's debt." But if you still doubt that this is a play about land ownership, let me present some more evidence that Juliet's wedding, even in her lovesick mind, is primarily about the inheritance of land. First of all, Juliet is encouraged by her father to marry the count known as Paris. And at the party at the Capulet estate, when her father is talking with Paris, he even describes his daughter in terms of soil. She is the hopeful lady of my earth. Then foreshadows the marriage he wants between them by promising an inheritance of land. Even such delight among fresh fennel buds shall you this night inherit at my house. Oddly, the title of Paris here isn't Count. Instead, he's referred to as County Paris, and at one point her nurse tells Juliet, "Since the case so stands as now it doth, I think it best you married with the county." This is the only play in the first folio to refer to counts, both Paris and Anselm, as counties, which are territorial divisions of land. The normal convention used everywhere else in the first folio is that of Count Melun in King John, Count Claudio in Much Ado About Nothing, and the Count of Roussillon in All's Well That Ends Well. This break with convention suggests that it's wordplay regarding the field counts taken for taxation at the Exchequer, all based on the production of the land. With this in mind, the nurse's advice for Juliet is to literally marry the land. When Juliet falls in love with Romeo but discovers he belongs to the rival house of Montague, she uses a specifically legal phrase describing her love for Romeo as a prodigious birth. In Black's Law Dictionary, this phrase describes a legal monster, someone prohibited from inheriting land. If Juliet marries this enemy of the family, she'll lose her inheritance as well. And now we come to the play's use of the word demean. Shakespeare doesn't use this term often, only in Romeo and Juliet and Cymbeline. We encountered the word demean earlier when we looked at the gavelkind and primogeniture customs of handling land inheritance. It's a law French term meaning the feudal lord's land, but it later evolved into the word domain, or the land attached to a manor house or mansion. In Act 2, Scene 1, Mercutio gives a salacious reference to Rosaline, the girl Romeo had previously loved, describing her quivering thigh and the demesnes that there adjacent lie, likening her crotch to a plot of feudal land. The word demesnes is also used by Capulet in Act 3, Scene 5, where he vents his frustration that his attempts to marry Juliet to Paris have been thwarted. Still my care hath been to have her matched, and having now provided a gentleman of noble parentage of fair demesnes. That Capulet's intention is being thwarted regarding the descent of his lands is a likely allusion to the grantor's intent that can be thwarted by the rule in Shelley's case. Although the rule was later abolished, it was still very much a working law when Romeo and Juliet was written. And here, Capulet fights back, attempting to retain his intention when he literally demeans Juliet to the position of a cow on the land. Graze where you will, you shall not house with me. For by my soul I'll ne'er acknowledge thee, nor what is mine shall never do thee good. She will not inherit if she goes against her father's intent. But what an incredible play on words. The English demeans, meaning degrades, and the French domains, meaning domains. Beyond all that is the play's repeating metaphor of mansions and homes. First, Juliet likens her love for Romeo to a house. "Oh, I have bought the mansion of a love, but not possessed it, and though I am sold, not yet enjoyed." This is a direct allusion to the legal device of a use discussed by Francis Bacon in his reading and analysis of the Statute of Uses of 1536. The device separates the ownership title, here being taken by Juliet, from the occupation or benefit of the land, held by some other beneficiary, as sestque use, or he who has use. And the feud between the two families is framed as a feud between the two houses of Montague and Capulet. In fact, Mercutio's death is prefaced by his agonized cry of "a plague a both your houses." But more than that, the feud between Montague and Capulet is linguistically related back to feudalism, the rigid laws of land transfer, including primogeniture. Even more important is the next housing metaphor used in Act 3, Scene 3, when Romeo uses the term mansion to ask where his name is placed. As if that name, shot from the deadly level of a gun, did murder her. "Oh, tell me, friar, tell me, in what vile part of this anatomy doth my name lodge? Tell me, that I may sack the hateful mansion." One might even think the author of this play could have had knowledge of the legal arguments regarding corporate name and place, someone like Francis Bacon. Romeo's banishment from Verona is the use of city limits, metes and bounds, as a negative prison. In Act 3, Scene 2, Juliet then speaks of both Romeo's banishment and her own grief in terms of metes and bounds. Romeo is banished. There is no end, no limit, measure, bound in that word's death. And just as words of limitation were legal descriptors of the land as a state, Juliet's line is a complex play on words regarding the land that Romeo can't, in his banishment, inherit or purchase. This legal terminology tells us not only that the play was written by a legal mind, but that the play itself is commentary on property law, culminating in this wordplay between Benvolio and Mercutio in Act 3, Scene 1. "And I were so apt to quarrel as thou art, any man should buy the fee simple of my life for an hour and a quarter." The fee simple, oh simple. A fee simple interest in land denotes absolute ownership that lasts forever, which is why Benvolio's joke is funny. Any fee simple interest in the life of such a quarreling, sword-wielding man would last only a little over an hour. This isn't just a legal joke, it's a real estate joke. And consider this line from the prince: "I will be deaf to pleading and excuses, nor tears nor prayers shall purchase out abuses." He's banishing Romeo from Verona, his homeland, and announces poetically that he'll pass this judgment without court pleadings. That judgment of banishment is defined by the parameters of place, the city limits of Verona. And finally, while Juliet lies in a fictional death, Capulet personifies death in the role of her husband, showing that maneuvering the inheritance was the only motive for marriage in his mind. Death is my son-in-law, death is my heir. It's death that will inherit the Capulet estate. So what about love? Does this underlying focus on land mean there's nothing of love in Romeo and Juliet? When Juliet is in the orchard, she asks Romeo, "How camest thou hither? Tell me, and wherefore? The orchard walls are high and hard to climb, and the place death. Considering who thou art, if any of my kinsmen find thee here." In these lines, her focus is on place. She asks him again, "By whose direction foundst thou out this place?" And Romeo responds that it was by love. This is the same answer Elizabeth Temple gives Miss Marple regarding the death of Verity. When she spoke, she uttered one word. It echoed like the tone of a deep bell, so much that it was startling. "Love," she said, "one of the most frightening words there is in the world." It's the desire for love, the hormonal drive toward incorporation, that turns both Romeo and Juliet and Nemesis into tragedies. It's love, the drive toward incorporation, that moves Verity out of the old manor house of the Bradbury Scotts and toward her marriage at Raphael House. And it's this same love, or drive toward incorporation, that brings Romeo into the enemy orchard of the Capulets. This might suggest that the act of incorporation can be a very dangerous thing, whether done emotionally, psychologically, or worst of all, legally. But if love brings Verity and Romeo into dangerous places, it's the legal elevation by Edward Cook of name over place that gets them both killed. It's Romeo's name that invites the hostility and violence of the Capulets. And it's the doubly angelic, even saintly name of Michael Raphael, ironically attached to his reputation in the village as a bad lot, that ultimately kills Verity. Notice that I didn't say Michael Raphael killed Verity. He didn't. But we can infer that Agatha Christie is saying something with his symbolic name. The saintly archangels of the Catholic corporate church and their proximity to the death of truth. Name kills truth, or more specifically, transforms a real entity back into a fiction. And it's in this context, regarding the power of names, that Miss Marple identifies herself to the killer at the end of the Agatha Christie novel, saying, "One of my names is Nemesis." The modern definition of nemesis is a rival or arch-enemy. And in the novel Nemesis, Agatha Christie seems to be placing an emphasis on the Roman arch. As already mentioned, the falsely accused killer, Michael Raphael, is named for two archangels, and Tour 37 is focused on indoor and outdoor architecture, as well as ecclesiastical architecture, pointing back to the Roman Catholic Church and the Roman buildings shown throughout the 1987 BBC version. Finally, Archdeacon Brabazon appears as a character in a very similar role to that of Friar Lawrence in Romeo and Juliet, as the clergyman consulted to marry Michael Raphael and Verity Hunt. The name Brabazon means mercenary or hired assassin, which could cast all sorts of weird aspersions on Friar Lawrence and his chemical potions, or maybe on the act of incorporation itself. Juxtaposing all of these arches in Christie's Nemesis is the concept of anarchy, first mentioned in Chapter 20, when Emlyn Price is described as anarchistic. Of course, anarchy means opposed to rulers or archons, and because governance as a concept is overarching, it can be symbolized by the Greco-Roman arch itself. But what if anarchy means something more than simply being opposed to rulers? Being opposed to the arch itself could be symbolized by its geometric opposite, the valley or pit. And so, the name of Christie's anarchist, Emlyn, which means valley, could be symbolizing a geometrical opposition to arches. According to this mythology website, the combination of the sky's arch and the underworld's bowl frame reality itself. Tartarus was envisaged as the opposite of the sky, an inverted dome lying beneath the flat earth. Together, the Uranian dome and Tartarian pit enclose the entire cosmos in an egg-shaped or spherical shell. The arch and pit are each half of the whole. Alexander Pope described the force creating them as the ambitious hill scaling the heavens, or that which scoops out the veil. Stacked, they form the egg-shaped sphere, and offset, they form the sine wave. But Tartarus has a much deeper connection to Christie's novel, because Tartarus was the primordial god romantically coupled to the Greek goddess Nemesis. In fact, the couple had several children known as the Telchines. They were cultivators of the soil and were said to have invented metalworking. Tartarus was also the personification of the place known as Tartarus or Hell, the abyss, the underworld. And because he's a place personified, he fully expresses the concept of Genius Loci, the spirit of place. Tartarus, as place, was not just a low area of land, but also a place of banishment. Coincidentally, the banishment of Romeo is foreshadowed by Friar Lawrence when he speaks of Titan's fiery wheels, as Tartarus was the place to which the Titans were banished. In the play, the word banished is emphasized by Juliet as one word, in Act 3, Scene 2. Tybalt is dead and Romeo banished, that one word banished. We see the same phrase highlighting the one word in Nemesis, but here there are two one words. The first is defined by Miss Marple, who spoke the one word Nemesis to Jason Raphael. The second was defined by Elizabeth Temple, giving the one word explanation for Verity's death being love. And who was the love interest of Nemesis? Tartarus, the deity and place of banishment. When you're banished, you must leave your community, your group, your society. You are ceremonially unbound. Admittedly, this is a lot to process in one sitting. In Part 2, we'll look down one more literary rabbit hole, courtesy of Jules Verne. And then Dane's research will supply the chords, the coordinates that tie it all together. I'm grateful for any feedback. Please leave your thoughts in the comments, and thank you for watching.